Juana Barraza was born in 1957 in the rural outskirts of Hidalgo, Mexico, into a life already defined by violence and abandonment. Her mother was an alcoholic who frequently disappeared for days at a time, leaving Juana alone without food or protection. When Juana was still a child, her mother traded her to a man in exchange for alcohol. The abuse that followed was prolonged, brutal, and formative. It did not happen once, it happened repeatedly, and no one intervened. From an early age, Juana learned that suffering could exist without witnesses, that pain could be normalized, and that survival sometimes required emotional detachment. These early experiences would later resurface in ways no one could have predicted. By her teenage years, Juana had already endured more trauma than most people experience in a lifetime. She ran away, drifting through Mexico City, finding work wherever she could, cleaning homes, washing clothes, and eventually training as a professional wrestler. In the world of lucha libre, Juana adopted the ring name La Dama del Silencio. The nickname was meant to be theatrical, but it would later become chillingly prophetic. In the ring, she wore masks, embraced physical dominance, and learned how to control bodies larger than her own. Wrestling offered structure, applause, and a controlled outlet for aggression. Outside the ring, however, her life remained unstable. She struggled financially, raised children alone, and carried unresolved rage especially toward older women who, in her mind, symbolized her mother. By the late 1990s, elderly women across Mexico City began dying under disturbing circumstances. At first, the deaths seemed natural. The victims were often in their 70s or 80s, lived alone, and had no obvious signs of forced entry. Police initially recorded many of the cases as accidental falls or heart failures. It was only when forensic patterns began to emerge that investigators realized something far more sinister was unfolding. The women were being strangled. Scarves, telephone cords, belts, and even bare hands were used. Some victims were sexually assaulted. Others were beaten before death. Jewelry and small valuables were sometimes missing, leading investigators to believe robbery was the motive. But the level of violence far exceeded what was necessary for theft. These were not opportunistic crimes. They were personal. Witnesses occasionally reported seeing a woman leaving the victims' homes. Often she was described as dressed like a social worker, a nurse, or a government aid employee. She spoke politely. She gained trust in communities where elderly women relied on public assistance and charity programs. Such a visitor would never raise suspicion. This access was her weapon. Between 1998 and 2006, the body count grew steadily. Estimates vary, but authorities later attributed at least 40 murders to Juana Barraza, with some investigators believing the true number may be higher. The victims all fit the same profile: elderly, isolated women, many living in poverty, many dependent on state services. Each death deepened public fear, especially among older women who began refusing to open their doors to anyone they didn't know. Media coverage exploded. The killer was dubbed La Mata Viejitas, the old lady killer. Early police theories were disastrously wrong. Investigators believed the murderer had to be a man, possibly a transvestite, due to the strength required to overpower victims. This assumption delayed progress for years. Composite sketches depicted a male suspect. Entire investigations were misdirected. Meanwhile, Juana continued killing. The turning point came in January 2006. An 80-year-old woman was found strangled in her home in Mexico City. Neighbors reported seeing a woman fleeing the scene. Police canvassed the area and detained Juana Barraza nearby. She was carrying a stethoscope and identification suggesting she worked in social services, both later proven false. Initially, she denied involvement, but physical evidence told a different story. Forensic analysis revealed that fibers from her clothing matched those found at multiple crime scenes. DNA linked her to several murders. Witnesses identified her. The pattern was undeniable. When confronted with the evidence, Juana confessed to killing at least one woman, but denied responsibility for others. Over time, however, the scope of her crimes became clear. During interrogation, Juana spoke chillingly calmly. She expressed little remorse. When asked why she targeted elderly women, she blamed her mother. She described her rage as uncontrollable, triggered whenever she saw older women who reminded her of the abuse she had suffered. Psychologists later diagnosed her with antisocial personality disorder and severe trauma-related pathology, but she was deemed fully competent to stand trial. The trial shocked Mexico. A female serial killer, particularly one who preyed on elderly women, defied cultural expectations. Courtroom testimony detailed horrific crime scenes, with prosecutors methodically walking jurors through years of violence that had gone undetected due to systemic bias and investigative failure. Families of victims listened as the final moments of their loved ones were reconstructed in excruciating detail. In 2008, Juana Barraza was convicted of multiple counts of murder and sentenced to 759 years in prison, the maximum sentence allowed under Mexican law. She will never be eligible for release. She currently remains incarcerated in Santa Marta Acatitla prison. The aftermath of her crimes left lasting scars. Elderly women across Mexico City lived in fear long after her arrest. Public trust in social service workers was deeply damaged. Law enforcement agencies faced intense scrutiny for their gender-based assumptions and investigative delays. The case became a textbook example of how bias can blind authorities to reality, allowing predators to operate in plain sight. Juana Barraza's story is not only about murder. It is about how untreated trauma can metastasize into violence, how social systems fail the vulnerable, both victims and offenders, how evil does not always look the way we expect. She was not a shadowy man in an alley. She was a woman who knocked politely, smiled, and stepped inside. And once the door closed, silence followed. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary. Francisco Guerrero Pérez was born in 1840 in Mexico City, at a time when the nation was still struggling to define itself after independence. His early life unfolded in the narrow streets and crowded tenements near the city center, where poverty, crime, and disease were constant companions. From childhood, Guerrero lived on the margins of society, exposed to violence as something ordinary rather than exceptional. By the time he reached adulthood, he had already developed a reputation as a troublemaker, impulsive, and prone to sudden outbursts of rage. He worked sporadically as a shoemaker, a trade that gave him just enough money to survive, but no sense of purpose or stability. Those who knew him described him as volatile, deeply resentful of women, and easily humiliated. He drank heavily, spent nights wandering the city, and carried a growing hatred that seemed to have no clear source. In public, he was unremarkable. In private, he nurtured fantasies of domination and revenge. Mexico City in the late 19th century was a dangerous place, especially for women living in poverty. Prostitution was widespread, driven by desperation rather than choice. Many women lived alone, worked at night, and had little protection from the law. It was within this environment that Guerrero found his victims. He targeted young women on the fringes of society's sex workers, domestic servants, and women with no family connections who might ask questions if they disappeared. Between 1880 and 1888, the city began to experience a wave of murders that terrified the population. Women were found dead in vacant lots, alleyways, and abandoned buildings. Their bodies bore signs of extreme violence, strangulation marks, blunt force trauma, and sexual assault. In several cases, the victims had been mutilated after death, suggesting a level of rage that went beyond killing itself. At first, authorities treated the murders as unrelated incidents, assuming they were the result of drunken fights or crimes of passion. As the body count grew, patterns emerged. The victims were almost always women. Many had been last seen in the company of a man matching Guerrero's description. Yet policing in Mexico City at the time was deeply flawed. Corruption was rampant, forensic science was primitive, and social prejudice meant the deaths of poor women were not prioritized. Investigations were slow, inconsistent, and often abandoned entirely. Guerrero, meanwhile, continued killing with increasing confidence. He stalked his victims, lured them into secluded areas, and attacked with sudden, overwhelming force. Strangulation was his preferred method, often performed with his bare hands. Witnesses later testified that he seemed to derive satisfaction not only from killing but from watching life drain from his victims. In some cases, he remained at the scene after death, rearranging clothing or inflicting additional injuries. The press eventually dubbed him El Chalequero, a reference to the distinctive vest he often wore. Newspapers sensationalized the murders, turning public fear into daily spectacle. Women were warned not to walk alone at night. Parents locked daughters indoors. Vigilante groups formed in some neighborhoods, patrolling streets with clubs and knives. The city was gripped by paranoia. Despite mounting evidence, Guerrero managed to evade capture for years. He was arrested multiple times for minor offenses, including assault and disorderly conduct, but released each time. Witness statements were ignored or lost. Victims' identities were often poorly documented, making it difficult to connect cases. Each failure emboldened him further. In 1888, Guerrero was finally arrested after being caught near the body of a murdered woman. This time, public pressure forced authorities to act. During interrogation, he confessed to several murders, though he minimized the number and blamed alcohol for his actions. Doctors examined him and debated whether he was insane. Some argued he was a moral degenerate, others that he was fully aware of his crimes. He was convicted and sentenced to death, but political instability and legal delays intervened. His sentence was commuted, and he was eventually released after serving time. The decision outraged the public, but Guerrero vanished into the city once more. For a brief period, the murders stopped, leading some to believe he had changed or left the area. They were wrong. In the early 1900s, bodies began appearing again, women killed in the same manner, in the same districts. Guerrero had returned to killing, older but no less violent. This time, the evidence was overwhelming. He was arrested again and linked to multiple murders spanning decades. By then, he was an old man, physically weakened but still defiant. Francisco Guerrero Pérez died in prison in 1910, never formally convicted for all the murders attributed to him. Historians estimate he killed anywhere from 20 to 30 women, making him one of the earliest known serial killers in Mexican history. His crimes exposed deep failures in law enforcement, social inequality, and the value placed on the lives of poor women. His legacy is not just one of brutality, but of indifference. How a killer was allowed to operate for years because his victims were considered disposable. The streets where he hunted have long since changed, but the lesson remains chillingly relevant. When society looks away, predators thrive in the shadows. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary. Gregorio Cardenas Hernandez was born in 1915 in Mexico City into a family that outwardly valued discipline, education, and respectability. From an early age, he appeared intelligent, introspective, and socially withdrawn. Teachers praised his academic abilities, particularly in the sciences, and his family believed he was destined for a professional career that would lift them socially. No one suspected that behind his quiet demeanor, Gregorio was already developing a fractured inner world marked by obsession, resentment, and violent fantasy. As a teenager, Gregorio struggled to form relationships, especially with women. He was deeply insecure, hypersensitive to rejection, and prone to brooding over perceived slights. While others socialized, he retreated into isolation, finding comfort in books and rigid routines. Over time, this isolation hardened into something darker. He began to view women not as individuals, but as symbols of humiliation and desire, objects that could either validate or destroy him. In the late 1930s, Gregorio enrolled in medical studies, specializing in chemistry. The training sharpened his analytical mind and gave him knowledge that would later become a tool of violence. He rented a modest house in Tacubaya, a quiet neighborhood in Mexico City, presenting himself as a serious student focused on his future. To neighbors, he was polite, reserved, and entirely unthreatening. Between 1942 and 1943, 4 young women disappeared after being seen entering Gregorio's home. They were domestic workers, seamstresses, and women from working-class backgrounds, individuals whose absence did not immediately trigger large investigations. Each had responded to job offers or invitations that promised safety and opportunity. Once inside, they never left. Inside his home, Gregorio murdered them one by one. He strangled his victims, sometimes after hours of conversation, sometimes without warning. The killings were intimate, deliberate, and controlled. Afterward, he buried their bodies beneath the floors of his house, carefully sealing the graves to avoid detection. He continued attending classes, visiting family, and maintaining the appearance of normal life while the bodies decomposed beneath his feet. What ultimately exposed him was not forensic brilliance, but suspicion. Neighbors noticed unusual smells and disturbances. A missing woman's family pressed authorities to investigate after learning she had last been seen entering Gregorio's residence. Police searched the property and uncovered shallow graves beneath the floor. The discovery horrified the city. Gregorio was arrested and interrogated. At first, he confessed calmly, providing detailed accounts of the murders. He described feelings of relief after killing, a sense of control he could not achieve elsewhere in life. Psychiatrists examined him extensively, debating whether he was insane or fully aware of his actions. The case ignited national debate about criminal responsibility and mental illness, topics rarely discussed openly in Mexico at the time. In 1943, he was convicted of murder and sentenced to prison. Newspapers labeled him El Estrangulador de Tacuba, turning him into a symbol of hidden evil lurking behind respectable facades. The public was shocked, not just by the brutality of the crimes, but by who committed them. Well, a man from a good family, studying medicine, capable of polite conversation and calculated murder. What happened next made the case even more disturbing. After serving decades in prison, Gregorio underwent psychiatric treatment and rehabilitation programs. Authorities eventually deemed him reformed. In 1976, he was released on parole. Not only that, he was allowed to reintegrate fully into society. He completed his education, earned a degree in law, and began working as a legal advisor. He even participated in crime prevention talks, presenting himself as an example of successful rehabilitation. For many, his release was incomprehensible. Families of the victims were still alive, still grieving. The idea that a man who murdered 4 women and buried them under his floor could walk free felt like a betrayal of justice. Yet Gregorio lived openly, gave interviews, and spoke about remorse, insisting he was no longer the man he once was. Gregorio Cárdenas Hernández died in 1999, a free man. His story remains one of the most unsettling chapters in Mexican criminal history, not only because of the murders, but because of what followed. It forces an uncomfortable question. Can someone who commits calculated, repeated murder truly be rehabilitated? Or does society sometimes mistake composure and education for redemption? The women he killed never received a second chance. They never walked free. And beneath the quiet streets of Tacuba, their memory lingers as a reminder that evil does not always announce itself with chaos. It can speak softly, study diligently, and smile politely while hiding unimaginable darkness just below the surface. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary. Juan Carlos Hernández grew up in the state of Mexico surrounded by instability, addiction, and neglect. His childhood was marked by poverty and exposure to violence at an early age. He drifted through adolescence without structure, accumulating petty crimes and a growing reputation for aggression. By the time he reached adulthood, he had already been arrested multiple times for theft and assault. Yet each encounter with the justice system ended the same way: short releases and a return to the same environment that had shaped him. At some point in his early adult life, Juan Carlos met Patricia Martinez. Their relationship was volatile, rooted in dependency rather than affection. Friends and neighbors later described them as insular and erratic, a couple that kept to themselves but frequently argued behind closed doors. Together, they lived in Ecatepec, one of Mexico's most dangerous municipalities, a place already scarred by high rates of violence against women. Between 2012 and 2018, women and children began disappearing from Ecatepec at alarming rates. Many were young mothers, some were minors, others were elderly women living alone. Families filed missing persons reports that often went unanswered for weeks or months. In a system overwhelmed by volume and under-resourced by design, disappearances blurred into statistics. Juan Carlos and Patricia exploited this reality. They targeted vulnerable women, those selling goods on the street, looking for work, or caring for children alone. Juan Carlos would approach them with casual conversation, sometimes offering help, sometimes pretending to need assistance himself. Once trust was established, he lured them to their home. What happened next was systematic, deliberate, and horrifying. Inside the house, Juan Carlos strangled his victims, while Patricia assisted or watched. Some women were sexually assaulted before death. Children were murdered as collateral, their lives extinguished simply because they were present. Afterward, the couple dismembered the bodies, storing remains in refrigerators, freezers, and plastic containers. Some body parts were disposed of in nearby areas, others were kept as trophies. What makes this case especially disturbing is how long it continued, despite clear warning signs. Neighbors reported foul odors. Others noticed suspicious behavior, including the burning of materials late at night. Authorities responded intermittently, often dismissing concerns as domestic issues or routine waste disposal. The assumption that violence was simply part of life in Ecatepec allowed it to continue unchecked. The couple's arrest in October 2018 came not from proactive investigation, but chance. Juan Carlos was detained after attempting to abduct a woman and her child in broad daylight. Witnesses intervened. Police searched his home and uncovered human remains, bones, skull fragments, and evidence of multiple murders. What they found would shock the nation. During interrogation, Juan Carlos confessed to killing dozens of women. He described the murders with chilling detachment, claiming he killed to cleanse society. He admitted to consuming human flesh and selling baby clothing taken from victims. Patricia initially denied involvement, but evidence placed her at the scenes, complicit in luring victims and concealing bodies. Investigators linked the couple to at least 10 confirmed murders. Though Juan Carlos claimed responsibility for over 20, many cases could not be conclusively tied due to decomposition, missing evidence, and failures in earlier investigations. Families of the disappeared were left with partial answers: bones instead of bodies, confirmation instead of closure. The trial exposed deep systemic failures. Several victims had previously reported harassment or threats. Some had been documented as missing long before the couple's arrest. Yet those reports sat dormant. Public outrage followed, not only toward the killers, but toward institutions that had failed to act, while women vanished in plain sight. Juan Carlos Hernandez was sentenced to life imprisonment. Patricia Martinez received a lengthy sentence for her role. Their house was demolished, but the trauma they left behind could not be erased. Ecatepec became a symbol of femicide, institutional neglect, and the terrifying efficiency of predators operating where society looks away. Their story is not only about brutality, it is about invisibility, about how certain lives, poor, female, marginalized, can disappear repeatedly without urgency. Juan Carlos and Patricia did not hide in darkness. They operated openly, in a community conditioned to expect violence and receive silence in response. And that silence, more than anything, allowed them to keep killing. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped, or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary. Raul Acil Marroquin Reyes was born in 1983 in the northern Mexican state of Tamaulipas, growing up in a conservative, deeply religious household. From the outside, his upbringing appeared strict but stable. His family emphasized obedience, morality, and reputation, leaving little room for emotional openness or deviation from social norms. As a child, Raul was quiet, introspective, and compliant, rarely causing trouble. But beneath that surface, he was struggling with an identity he believed he was forbidden to acknowledge. As he entered adolescence, Raul became increasingly isolated. He realized he was gay in a social environment where homosexuality was treated as sinful, dangerous, and shameful. Rather than finding acceptance, he internalized hatred toward himself and eventually toward others who reflected the identity he was trying to suppress. Friends later recalled him becoming withdrawn, rigid in his behavior, and emotionally distant. He clung to religion not for comfort, but as a weapon against his own thoughts. In his early 20s, Raul moved to Mexico City, where anonymity offered him a chance to reinvent himself. He studied engineering and secured work that placed him among professionals, allowing him to present a controlled, respectable image. He dressed neatly, spoke softly, and avoided attention. To colleagues and neighbors, he appeared disciplined and devout. No one suspected the violent fantasies that were taking shape behind closed doors. Around Arlingling, Raul began frequenting online chat rooms and dating platforms aimed at gay men. But unlike most users, his intent was not connection. He viewed these men as symbols of what he despised within himself. His interactions were methodical. He chose victims carefully, men who lived alone, often far from family, who would be unlikely to be immediately missed. He arranged private meetings, usually at the victim's home, where familiarity and trust created vulnerability. Once inside, the encounters turned lethal. Raul strangled his victims, sometimes using his hands, sometimes improvised tools. The killings were silent, controlled, and deliberate. Afterward, he remained in the apartment for hours or days. He cleaned, showered, ate food from the refrigerator, and sometimes slept in the victim's bed. He stole personal belongings, including credit cards, phones, and identification, using them to finance his movements and delay detection. Between 2005 and 2006, young men across Mexico City began disappearing. Families filed missing persons reports. Some victims were found dead in their apartments, others were never recovered. The similarities between cases went unnoticed at first. Law enforcement treated them as isolated incidents, robberies gone wrong, or lifestyle-related violence, a reflection of entrenched prejudice that deprioritized the deaths of gay men. Raul continued killing, gaining confidence with each success. He refined his process, learning how to avoid leaving obvious signs of forced entry. In several cases, neighbors reported nothing unusual. Doors were locked. Apartments were quiet. The deaths blended into the city's background noise of crime and neglect. His arrest in 2006 came after he attempted to withdraw money using a victim's bank card. Surveillance footage captured his image. Police tracked him down and searched his residence, where they discovered personal items belonging to multiple missing men. Under interrogation, Raul initially denied everything, but confronted with evidence, he confessed. What he revealed stunned investigators. Raul admitted to killing at least 4 men but later confessed to 7. Some experts believe the true number may be higher. He described the murders with disturbing calm, framing them as acts of purification. He claimed he was eliminating temptation, destroying reflections of a life he believed was immoral. Psychologists later diagnosed him with severe internalized homophobia combined with antisocial personality traits. He was fully aware of his actions and showed little genuine remorse. The trial exposed not only his crimes, but the failures that allowed him to operate. Investigators acknowledged that earlier cases had not been connected due to bias and lack of coordination. Families of victims spoke publicly about how their concerns had been dismissed, how reports were delayed, and how their loved ones' lives were treated as expendable. In Arlington, Rohl Marroquin Reyes was convicted and sentenced to 60 years in prison, one of the harshest penalties available at the time. He remains incarcerated, largely isolated from other inmates, due to the nature of his crimes. The aftermath of his case forced uncomfortable conversations in Mexico about violence within marginalized communities and the consequences of institutional prejudice. Activists argued that if the victims had fit a different social profile, the killings might have been connected sooner. The silence that surrounded their disappearances had functioned as cover. Raul's story is deeply unsettling because it reveals how hatred can be cultivated inward, how denial can turn into destruction, and how violence can be rationalized through ideology. His victims were not random. They were chosen because they reflected something he could not accept in himself. In the end, his crimes were not acts of moral judgment, but of profound self-loathing projected outward, leaving behind lives erased, families devastated, and a reminder that when society teaches people to hate who they are, that hatred does not remain contained. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary. Goyo Cárdenas was already a name, whispered with fear in Mexico decades before his crimes were fully understood. Born Gregorio Cárdenas Hernández in 1915, his earlier murders had shocked the nation, but what followed after his release made his story even more disturbing. His case did not end with conviction. It evolved into a cautionary tale about trust, rehabilitation, and the terrifying consequences when society believes a monster has been cured. After serving more than 3 decades in prison for the murders of 4 young women in the 1940s, he strangled and buried beneath the floors of his home. Gregorio was released in the 1970s. Authorities cited good behavior, psychiatric evaluations suggesting reform, and his intellectual achievements behind bars. He had studied law, written essays, and spoken openly about remorse. To the system, he was proof that even the worst offenders could change. To the families of the victims, his release felt like a second betrayal. Once free, Gregorio reintegrated into public life with alarming ease. He worked as a legal advisor, appeared in academic circles, and was even invited to speak about crime prevention and rehabilitation. Newspapers portrayed him as a redeemed man, someone who had confronted his past and emerged transformed. The same calm, intelligent demeanor that once masked his crimes now reassured those around him. But beneath the surface, something was wrong. People close to him later recalled moments of unsettling behavior, obsessive routines, emotional coldness, and a disturbing fascination with violence in conversation. He spoke about his past not with grief, but with detachment, as though describing an experiment. Yet because he did not kill again, at least not in a way that could be proven, these warning signs were ignored. Society wanted redemption. It needed to believe in it. The true horror of Gregorio's story lies not in confirmed additional murders, but in the uncertainty. Several women disappeared in areas where he lived and worked after his release. None were conclusively linked to him. Evidence was circumstantial. Investigations stalled. Authorities hesitated to pursue a man who had become a symbol of successful rehabilitation. To accuse him again would be to admit catastrophic failure. Families of the missing were left with questions that were never answered. Psychiatrists later re-examined his case, arguing that his apparent reform may have been performative or learned adaptation, rather than genuine change. He understood exactly what professionals wanted to hear. He knew how to present remorse, how to intellectualize guilt, how to cloak predatory instincts beneath eloquence and education. In prison, he had not been cured, he had been refined. Gregorio Cárdenas Hernández died in 1999 as a free man. Officially, his crimes remained confined to the 4 murders that first put him behind bars. Unofficially, his legacy is far darker. His case exposed the limits of rehabilitation assessments, especially when dealing with highly intelligent offenders capable of manipulation. It raised a question that still haunts criminal justice systems worldwide. How do you measure remorse when someone knows how to fake it? His story is disturbing not because of how it began, but because of how it was allowed to continue. He did not escape prison. He was released. He did not hide. He was embraced. And in that embrace, the boundary between justice and faith collapsed. Gregorio taught the system how to trust him, and that may have been his final, most dangerous act. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped, or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary. Adolfo Constanzo was born in Miami, Florida, in 1962, but the darkness that would define his life took shape across borders, cultures, and belief systems. His mother was deeply involved in occult practices, introducing him to ritualistic magic from an early age. As a child, he was taught that power could be summoned, that blood held meaning, and that violence could be justified if it served a higher purpose. By the time he reached adolescence, these ideas were no longer symbolic to him, they were literal. Adolfo was intelligent, charismatic, and unnervingly persuasive. He moved easily between worlds, blending mysticism with criminal ambition. In the early 1980s, he relocated to Mexico, where his charm and confidence attracted followers. He presented himself as a spiritual leader, a man who could offer protection, success, and invincibility through ritual. To those drawn to him, he was not dangerous, he was powerful. What made Adolfo especially disturbing was not just his belief system, but how effectively he weaponized it. He convinced his followers that human sacrifice was necessary to ensure prosperity and protection from law enforcement. He claimed blood rituals could make them invisible to bullets, untouchable by police, immune to consequences, and many believed him. By the mid-1980s, Adolfo had established a cult-like group that included drug traffickers, students, and disaffected young people searching for purpose. They operated primarily in Matamoros, Tamaulipas, a city already steeped in violence due to cartel activity. Under the cover of narcotics trafficking, Adolfo orchestrated a series of ritual murders that blurred the line between serial killing and organized crime. Victims were abducted, tortured, and murdered as offerings. Some were rival criminals, others were random targets, migrants, students, or anyone deemed expendable. The killings were brutal and ceremonial. Bodies were dismembered, organs were removed, blood was collected, remains were buried in shallow graves on ranches used by the group. Each death was framed as a necessary step toward dominance and protection. For years, these murders went unnoticed or were absorbed into the broader violence of the drug war. Missing persons reports piled up. Families searched without answers. Authorities often assumed victims had crossed paths with cartels and moved on. The chaos of the region served as camouflage, allowing Adolfo's cult to operate with terrifying freedom. The case finally unraveled in 1989 after the disappearance of an American college student traveling through Mexico. International pressure forced Mexican authorities to investigate more aggressively. What they uncovered was beyond anything they expected. On a ranch outside Matamoros, police discovered mass graves containing mutilated bodies. Evidence of ritual sacrifice was everywhere. Witnesses described chants, blood rituals, and the belief that killing was a form of protection. Several members of the cult were arrested and confessed, implicating Adolfo as the leader and spiritual architect of the murders. By then, however, he was already on the run. As authorities closed in, Adolfo chose control over capture. In May 1989, he ordered one of his followers to kill him. He believed death on his own terms would preserve his power and deny the state its victory. His death did not bring closure. Investigators linked him to at least 15 murders, though the true number is believed to be higher. Many victims were never identified. Families never recovered remains. The full scope of the cult's violence remains unknown, buried alongside incomplete records and unmarked graves. Adolfo Constanzo's legacy is uniquely disturbing because it demonstrates how belief can be manipulated into justification for atrocity. He did not kill in secret. He killed with witnesses, with followers, with ritual. His crimes were not hidden, they were normalized within his circle. He showed how charisma can override morality, how ideology can anesthetize conscience, and how violence becomes inevitable when someone convinces others that killing is sacred. His story is not just about murder. It is about influence, about how easily people can be led to commit horrors when fear and faith collide. And long after his death, the unanswered question remains: how many lives were taken in the name of a power that never existed? What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary. Sylvia Meraz was not feared at first. She was trusted. In the quiet town of Nacozari de Garcia, Sonora, she presented herself as a spiritual guide-woman who spoke softly about protection, healing, and divine favor. People came to her not because they sensed danger, but because they were desperate. They were sick, struggling financially, or afraid of the violence creeping closer to their lives. Sylvia promised answers. What she delivered was death. Little is known about her early life, and that absence itself is unsettling. Those who later tried to trace her past found no clear record of trauma dramatic enough to explain what followed. No obvious descent into madness. She appeared ordinary. That ordinariness became her greatest weapon. By the early 2000s, she had gathered a small but devoted group of followers who believed she possessed supernatural abilities. She spoke of spirits, of dark forces that demanded appeasement, and of rituals that could ward off misfortune. At first, the rituals were symbolic prayers, fasting, animal offerings, but gradually, Sylvia introduced darker ideas. She told her followers that animals were no longer sufficient. The spirits wanted more. They demanded blood tied by kinship, purity, and trust. Human sacrifice, she claimed, was the only way to ensure protection from impending catastrophe. What made Sylvia dangerous was not charisma alone, but certainty. She never hesitated when she spoke. She framed violence as necessity, murder as obedience. Those who questioned her were warned of dire consequences. Those who obeyed were promised safety. Over time, fear and faith fused into something indistinguishable. Between 2009 and 2010, members of the group began disappearing children and relatives of the followers themselves. The victims were not outsiders. They were sons, daughters, nephews, and cousins. Children who trusted the adults around them. Sylvia instructed her followers that the sacrifices had to be close to them to be effective. The closer the bond, the stronger the ritual. The killings were ritualized and horrifying. Victims were strangled or stabbed during ceremonies meant to appease unseen forces. Blood was collected. Bodies were buried in shallow graves. The followers participated actively, convinced they were preventing even greater disasters. Sylvia presided over these acts, not with frenzy, but with calm authority, as though conducting a necessary procedure. For months, no one outside the group suspected anything. Missing children were explained away with lies, runaways, family disputes, vague stories that stalled investigations. In small communities, people hesitate to accuse neighbors. Police resources were limited. Each delay allowed the cult to continue. The case finally came to light in 2010 when authorities investigating unrelated disappearances followed inconsistencies back to Sylvia's circle. Under questioning, one follower broke down and confessed. What police uncovered next was devastating. Human remains were exhumed from properties linked to the group. The victims were identified as children related to the perpetrators. The scope of betrayal stunned the nation. Sylvia Meraz was arrested, along with several accomplices. During interrogation, she showed little remorse. She spoke of sacrifices as obligations, insisting the deaths were justified. Psychologists later described her as manipulative, delusional, and entirely convinced of her own authority. Whether she truly believed in the rituals or used them as a means of control remains debated. What is clear is that she orchestrated the murders and directed others to kill. In court, the testimony was unbearable. Parents described participating in the deaths of their own children under Sylvia's influence. The line between victim and perpetrator blurred, leaving a legal and moral nightmare. Sylvia was convicted and sentenced to decades in prison. Her followers received long sentences as well. The aftermath left scars that will never heal. Families were destroyed from within. A community learned that evil does not always arrive with weapons or threats, can arrive wrapped in promises, faith, and certainty. Sylvia Meraz did not stalk strangers. She turned love into leverage and belief into a weapon. Her story is one of the most disturbing in Mexican history because it forces an uncomfortable truth. Some of the most dangerous killers never act alone. They convince others to do the killing for them. And once belief replaces conscience, the unimaginable becomes inevitable. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary.